Okay. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, great. My name is Isra Bhatti. I'm a criminal defense attorney here in the city. I'm actually an assistant federal public defender, but obviously not here in that capacity. I'm here with two esteemed judges, Judge Laurel Beeler out of the Northern District of California, and Judge Zia Faruqi, our local hometown magistrate judge, friendly magistrate judge. We're here to talk about diversion and alternatives to incarceration. I just been amplified. Okay. This is going to be a great discussion. So this issue is very close to my heart. I started working on reentry issues as a 16-year-old on the south side of Chicago. And I used to have to convince people to be interested in the issue, and it was a battle. But now I think with the dialogues that we're having in this country, what the legislation that we've seen come out of the Hill, people are quite interested in reentry as an issue and thinking about how we promote disengagement from crime. We've seen pretty bad statistics on folks re-engaging in criminal activity after they've exited the criminal justice system, and that's both federal and state. You know, the figures are probably well over 50% for folks who come back into the system, and sometimes closer to 2/3 or 70%. And I'm very excited because both of these judges have been implementing programs and procedures that get smart about how we help individuals disengage in the long term, whether that's through programs within prison, whether that's through alternatives to incarceration, whether that's through smarter programs on the exit side, so post-release. So I want to have the judges briefly introduce themselves, and then we're going to get into a little bit of discussion about how they got interested in what they're doing and what they've learned, and also some of the challenges that they faced. So, Magistrate Judge Beeler.
Hi, so I'm Laurel Beeler. As you said, I'm a magistrate judge in San Francisco, where it's a pretty great job. Really only 15% of my work is criminal these days because I have a pretty active civil trial docket, but I've retained my interest in all things criminal because I used to be in AUSA, and that's where I got interested in. Well, I became interested earlier, but hence my interest in the criminal justice system. So that's me in a line.
Good morning, everybody. Zia Faruqi, and I'm a magistrate judge here in DC Federal Court. So it's a little shorter commute than me for Judge Beeler. I am also, I think what's interesting, like Judge Beeler, a former prosecutor. So I hope that will perhaps give an interesting data point to people as they think about, you know, where do former prosecutors, when they become judges, or what is that role? Because I think there's a lot of focus on that. My criminal docket used to be smaller, but is quite occupied now because of the January 6th cases. Our court is the busiest it's ever been, and certainly outside of that, we have a standard criminal caseload. So between the two, we've been quite busy, but we're looking at, you know, interesting programs. A lot of what I do is just cut and paste what Judge Beeler does and then take credit for it. Like any good man, I take credit for so much work here at DC. And everyone says I'm doing a fabulous job. Hopefully my colleagues are watching today and they'll realize my secret, but I'm also a huge fan of Spotty. As she said, she's a federal public defender. She was previously at the White House and DOJ. So again, there's that sort of interesting, you know, can we take a broader view of this system? It's not just lock them up, release them, or something like that. Perhaps there's something rehabilitation and compassion in between.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I want to start with both of you have kind of touched on your journey to this point. You've both been AUSAs, which is an interesting connection because originally, at least, or traditionally, I should say, a lot of times when we talk about recidivism or reentry, it was seen as kind of a soft way to approach crime. I want to talk about your journeys here and how you've gotten to this point where you're implementing these types of programs and procedures that are thinking about reducing recidivism as an objective at a very early stage. So whether that's pre-conviction, whether that's sentencing, whether that's when you're thinking about supervised release. Can you talk a little bit about how you've gotten here, and some of the reasons why you're interested in this issue?
I'll jump in because I'm gonna give my journey just begins with I think I put in touch with Judge Wheeler and that really opened up a lot of doors to me, so perhaps it makes sense to not again do like that. But so as I said, I was a prosecutor. I came to become a magistrate judge. I primarily worked on cybercrime and national security work before when I was a prosecutor. And so the world of sort of the high volume of criminal cases that came before was something that I was, while aware of, but certainly not as exposed to. And it quickly became self-evident that there's a lot of issues involved in it in terms of not just equity, but public safety. Judge Sorokin, who is not a judge that I really admire the stories of in Boston, it's like these issues that come from public safety, right? About people taking accountability, finding ways that they can actually be held accountable, and also public safety, making sure the community is safe to the amount of citizen. And happy to talk about the later is pretty incredible restorative justice program that is a pretrial diversion program that, when successful, has had a near 100% success rate. So as I was sort of going through the daily grind, you are incarcerating people and then frequently you're seeing them return, you sort of feel a little bit, I think, if you're have some, still humanity left in you when you become a judge, you sort of become I think despondent, like it's very frustrating to see people who, for a variety of reasons, are harming their community. When one of the good things about the judges, a few things about us, is we live in our districts where we practice, and so we're part of that community. And then, there's a broader community, might be race or religion or whatever it is, ideology you see, like this community is being maligned and they are not thriving. And so I was kind of hopeless and starting to get frustrated because I didn't think that we were trying anything other than what had been tried and not true for hundreds of years. And so I got connected with the administrative office of the courts, and they said, "Did you talk to Judge Wheeler?" And so I can distinctly remember it was the height of the pandemic. I called her, and it's like one of those things where you call somebody like a cheat code or whatever, and like I was just trying to furiously write down everything she was saying, but I was also much more stressed out. I was like, "Oh my God, there is solutions to these problems. This person has them. Why doesn't everybody know about it?" And then, so we're trying to get to it. So the one that I will just highlight now before I hand off the microphone to her is she has developed this incredible program. And I think what's, everyone understands in government is this solution cannot be just go out and get a check and pay for the problem, right? That would be great, but we have to work with the limited resources we have. But, there's one of my favorite, for those who remember, it's a TV show called Simpsons. Marge Simpson finds this like designer dress. She gets to go to a country club and everyone takes her in because she has a designer dress. And then she realizes they only let her do the designer dress. So every day she's refashioning. She'll go and like alter the dress and refashion it so it's something new until someone picks up on it. But that to me is what we do with the government. We have one thing and then we just try to repurpose it like 15 different ways so we can squeeze everything out of it. So she, in working with the courts, found a fund that we could use to actually hire. So we just posted on the DC Court's website our first ever social worker that we're going to hire through the court to help people on pre-trial. Because if they're successful on pre-trial, it's the best indicator for a way to reduce their sentence, as well as people on supervision. And so I am really excited about this. We have so many community partners. So I can call the community resource manager here in DC or resource rich. I called another judge in El Paso and I told him about some of the things we're trying to do. And he's like, "Oh,
Right.
yeah,
He's great.
yeah,
Like Judge Sorokin too.
great." Because I was so Laura to call me. So yeah, that was again, she's the gatekeeper. She's telling me on the stuff, but he's just like, "You're just like me in DC, which is calling and begging for resources." I was like, "Yes, that's true." But he was able to work out a grant with a local university where he has several social workers now. And again, it's to get that sort of collaboration with community partners, with probation, pre-trial, all these different resources that you need someone to be in your care. And so that's one of the things we're working on. I'll hand off to Laura. So furiously take notes like I did. She's pure gold.
Oh, it's so nice of you to say that.
And she didn't pay me to say it.
And there's so many, it's so interesting because you talked about different judges and I talked to some of those same people as part of, learning at Judge Sorokin in particular. And in the District of Massachusetts. And what always strikes me is there are many different styles of how you can be as a lawyer or as a judge to approach this thing that we do, with this problem solve with the situations that are presented to us, right? So, and to echo a point you made, the thing about some of our interventions, like prison, is they're not, and I think what Judge Soroka is what you said, it's important about accountability, but they tend to be very poor solutions for things that are better treated on a medical model. And when you do the right interventions, everyone should care about reentry. I have a little thing I say now, reentry begins at arrest. But there are, and it used to be, those of you who are probation officers, there used to be a model of before, monograph 107 came out or whatever, trail them, nail them, and jail them, right? That was the approach to problem solving. And we've evolved. But it's really interesting on a bunch of levels. I'll talk about how I got there, but I'll name one thing. A lot, as in most of life, sometimes our fast inclinations suit us pretty well, Kahneman thinking fast and slow, but the fast reaction isn't always the right one. Harvard is a really great neuroscience program where they pack this all in, into a week about what, our intuitions about the right interventions aren't necessarily correct about reducing recidivism and promoting successful outcomes for people. So if, for example, drug addiction drives crime, it's putting someone in jail is just kicking the can down the road. And so, I think that's why we all should think it's important, why prosecutors should think it's important, why judges should think it's important, why defense lawyers should think it's important. Defense lawyers, by the way, can resist programs because they think it's setting clients up to fail. They don't want them talking to judges. It's changed in my district. Everybody has their clients talk to me now in my bail decisions because they know I like to hear from people directly. Probation, pretrial. There are different things we could do that are science-based interventions that actually work. And that's at every stage of the process, through initiation, the decision to arrest, through the initiation of prosecution, through all forms of supervision, through and continuing past sentencing. Okay, supervision. How did I get there? Sort of accidentally. I have a little bit of a different district in that, Washington is such a lots of U.S. Attorney's offices are in very specific places. The SDNY, for example, right? The financial capital of the United States. DC with, all of the work that it can. And I came up through the office, not just by going right into, an elite group doing terrorism. It's hard to argue with the fact that terrorism needs a different kind of intervention than the programs we talk about, right? But you start with small cases, you graduate to drug cases. And what happened to me is I think what we do is we tend to make each other other. We render people other because it can be too difficult to actually look at somebody and remember it's not us and them, it's just us. We're part of a community. And San Francisco is a small town. I don't know if you guys experienced DC as a small town, but San Francisco, the whole Bay Area is a really small town. And you feel like you get to know everybody. You feel like you know the lawyers, and it's really 7 by 7, even though the district is bigger. And when I moved into my OCDF, my drug group before graduating to white collar, which is totally different, totally not the same thing at all. I was so struck by how young everybody was and how crazy the sentences were. Mandatory minimums of 5 and 10 years, really big sentencing guidelines. And even if they're discretionary post Booker, people like rules and they like to follow them. And it just really struck me as crazy. And I really got tired of it. And then I happened to, there was a great guy who had been a defense lawyer named Jim Larson. And he was so great with people on supervision. He would do interventions and supervise them and haul them in for status appearances. All the things we know now were actually really effective interventions. And gradually, over time, when people got jobs, their views of themselves changed. They got more successful. He worked out, not everybody has addiction issues, right? So that with some of the younger, we have a younger an emerging adults program now too, that's not a drug court. And what I saw, which is what we all know from schools, people learn by doing. They learn how to address their addiction by engaging in treatment and cognitive behavioral interventions. I have a little joke now, which I say, which I now think, most people don't grow up and say, yeah, you know, I want to be a drug dealer. I think that would be a really great thing to be, you know, that's great. And I learned a few things. People actually really don't want to go to jail. People really sometimes don't have the skills to be successful because they never learned them. They don't have good executive level functioning skills, calendaring, showing up on time. And so I really experienced how, then I used to think if someone fainted at initial appearance, when they were told the 10-year mandatory minimum, like that person has a chance. And so gradually, that's how it started for me. I saw that people did well in supervision, and then a couple years into having a job, people's entire experience of themselves changed. Now, this was not an addicted population. It was interesting. This was a population that these were children of parents who had been incarcerated, and they were a parentless generation. That's what by the way, the cops, the police officers, the old school ones, they always knew this. And what they knew is people outgrew it. And then I started reading up on it. There were interesting studies done with, even with, you know, 15-year-old kids in New York State who had committed serious crimes, the benefits of cognitive behavioral therapy as an intervention. And so then, so that's where it started for me. And then of course, with things like addiction and the drug courts, which is where we all started, boy, are there effective interventions that really do reduce recidivism, because the crime very much is a function of the addiction. So that's a bit of a long path of how I got to where I was, but then I will say this, then I started visiting other drug courts, right? Ann Aiken in Oregon was an early one. Judge Sorokin in the District of Massachusetts was another. And I started as a prosecutor. It took me years to get my office to agree. I mean, I kind of stretched in. They didn't agree until I was a judge, but that's when we started our programs.
That's great. And I want to open up to questions from the audience so that we can make this more of a discussion. So please feel free to, you know, wait if you have a question and a mic. I think the mics are being passed around.
And if you speak up, we can always repeat the question back so people can hear.
So please flag down the mic and I'll call on you. But in the meantime, I don't know if there's a question right now, but in the meantime, I would love to hear specific programs that you found to be effective. You touched on drug courts, you touched on CBT. You've also touched on age and jobs as protective factors. And I would love to know if there's specific programs that you found to be effective, or kind of, you know, protocols and procedures that you found to be effective, or particular challenges that you've come across that you feel like the group should be aware of, and you know, anything that you're working to solve, especially when it crosses agencies, you're working with probation and parole or the executive.
Esther Salas is another great judge. Oh boy, that light's right in my eyes. Esther Salas is another. There we go. Esther Salas is in the District of Rhode Island. Recommended this book. They just fixed it. It's a book called "What Happened to You," and it's about trauma. And what we had not realized, and those of you who are on the pretrial probation side, is how much trauma informs people and how they grow up. And so we now routinely on the probation side, and I don't know if pretrial is moving towards it, we administer the trauma, the ACEs is what it's called, it's the tool. And it's crazy how trauma informed people are. And what's super interesting, and I'm talking about not just for, there's a guy at Stanford who says, treat the trauma, treat the addiction. And, you know, the other thing is, I will say, in the hierarchy of needs, if someone's homeless, you got to get them shelter. And so one of the things we learned, and the magic of therapy, it's not just the drug court model, it's just the trauma-informed approach to supervision. And there is no real mental health treatment in custody either. We're working on that too, on our in-custody programs. But I would say intervention number one, administer the trauma assessment. Intervention number two, and those of you who are officers know this, supervising officers, intervention number two, what are the programmatic components that you're going to put in for the person, and it might be, by the way, two classes that have great success in changing recidivism rates are parenting classes and anger management classes. I mean, so it's as simple as some of, and we live in resource-rich communities. It's not that we have to pay for all of this stuff necessarily. It's mostly free. But what we need to do is have the infrastructure in place from the supervision model. I mean, for a while I ran around and did a lot of it myself, and that was just not really doable. I already have 2 full-time jobs, just in my current job. But so I would just say those things inform all of our programs, which are both pre-conviction courts. You wind up with probation or no conviction at all, post-conviction supervision, these on the drug court models, and now our newest program, which is an emerging adult 18 to 25, usually not addicts. What we do is we look at risk, that's recidivism. We look at needs, what are the needs that need to be addressed? And it's a very individual approach to the specific programmatic elements that make somebody successful. So those are some of the tools.
Good question.
Yes, it's working. The book, What Happened to You, is really good. And then the author, Bruce Duncan Perry, he wrote another one, The Boy Who Was Raised with a Dog. And he has a program, I think it's called Child Trauma Academy in Texas. And it's really interesting. He talks about it, in The Boy Who Was Raised with a Dog. And basically what he does there is he meets children and adolescents where they are based on you might have heard of it, based on their cognitive or developmental needs. And he sees a lot of kids with, neglect and abuse and that sort of thing. He worked with the kids of Waco, and, he takes it back to, with his therapies, even somebody who, needs, missed stages at the age of 2 or that sort of thing, and they may be 15, and he goes back and he works with them with therapies that at stages that a 2-year-old should have learned had they been raised with parents who didn't neglect. So that's a program in Texas, and I don't know that it's widely used. I think his facility is really the only one that practices that, but I think it would be interesting to see more people kind of going there, learning from that, and taking that and applying it elsewhere in the country.
It's a great observation. This meet people where they are is a super important part of it. One of the interesting things, just to follow up on that point, with the trauma-informed therapy, you can build, our therapists come to our court sessions now, and they do it because we built it into our RFPs for programming. And I tell you, the magic of trauma-informed therapy and meeting people where they are. We've been lucky, 3 great therapists in a row. And our current therapist is a guy named Michael Red, who's amazing. And I always say everybody in the building is improved by a session with Michael, because he makes all of us a better person. But I think those are great observations. And I think we are reading those books and thinking about those approaches in designing our interventions.
Can I ask you a question? I'm just curious, are you in the supervision game, or how did you know about this?
No, no, not currently, but I got my MA in forensic psychology from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. We did a lot of study in psychology and clinical interviewing and assessment, and that was the focus of some of my.
Yeah, it's amazing.
But I'm mostly interested in behavioral threat assessment and management about extremism, but learned a lot about that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I'm definitely gonna, obviously, as usual, the world knows about this, but I had never heard of it, so I'm gonna check it out. I
Very
think.
interesting, the case, very sad.
Yeah.
Very sad, very sad.
Really terrible. Very interesting. Learn a lot from it, for sure.
I recommend the Libya, by the way, for your public library. You don't have, I stopped buying all these books because my bedroom is like filled with books I don't ever get to read, but like I got it on the Libby app and your library app, and but that's how I was able to read it after Judge Salas mentioned it too.
Great. Go ahead. Great.
Good morning. Sorry.
This is not, there we go, it's working better now. So first of all, you may not hear this often enough, but thank you for your service for both of you. As a veteran who hears that a lot, what I would tell you is that the service that you do is incredibly impactful. And specifically impactful to some of our veteran audiences too, because one of the challenges we see are crimes of belonging or identity. In other words, people becoming radicalized at one point or another in their lives and ultimately making choices based upon identities. And sir, you in particular can probably understand this with much of the work that you've done with the January 6th hearings. My question to you is, along this pathway of radicalization, whether it's those who are veterans, regardless of their cultural background, or any other particularly target group for some of these organizations, what have you seen as effective programs along the way? I'm a behavioral health, mental health counselor at this point in my career, also working for a nonprofit to help veterans transition. One of the challenges of transition is the big T isn't trauma, the big T is transition and belonging and identity. And ultimately, that's where individuals can become, if for lack of a better word, fruit for the picking for some of these organizations. And I wonder where, at what point, pre-incident, pre-trial, pre-crime, if you will, where we can help support these individuals beyond counseling. Thank you.
One thing I always say is it's, really we ought to be putting a lot of effort into preschools. There's some really interesting, I'm kind of joking and kind of not, there's some really good preschool studies in Pennsylvania where they look at metrics across all economic, socioeconomic, and every factor possible, and the outcomes from somebody using an effective preschool program. Not so much grades, right? It's sharing is caring kind of stuff and building a sense of community. And then the issue what you addressed is, what do? You can't give up on anybody in any state of the process, is my view. You can't give up on anybody, but certainly the earlier these interventions are, the sort of better the long-term results are. So it's a great question you pose. I mean, we do try to, we're a resource-rich community, and what we do is we try to, do the wraparound services model, whether it's addressing the shelter, literally the shelter issues, housing, putting in tools on a medical level to address addiction and trauma and all of the things in the veterans context. In the extremist, you guys have more of an experience with this. I'm super interested in hearing what you have to say on it. San Francisco's totally different pace. It's just not that. We did have one kid. And his dad was great. And I mean, he almost got himself, twice, 2 times. When I say kid, he was of age, but he was a kid. And, I gotta hand it to everybody came together because he was so young to try to design very specific interventions for him. He wasn't a vet, he was this terrorist related stuff, to design interventions for him to address the issues. So I don't know what you're
Sure.
about. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the kind words. To begin with, one thing I was just speaking last week to, we have what's called baby judge school. That's when judges come in and get in 1 week, you magically become all knowing and infallible, and also very funny because our jokes, you have to laugh, and that's cool. So I came in to talk about civic outreach, so actually talking to schools. And the thing that I start with whenever I do any civic engagement is to start with this. It's great that people go and thank veterans. I'm a coward, so I was never a veteran. I do play video games, so that's the closest I got. And I realized I'm not made for it. But if I were a veteran, the thing I would say is thank you, but what are you doing? Right? What are you doing? Because veterans put their lives in harm's way out, abroad and sometimes domestically as well. But we all cannot simply thank them for our service. We have to get off the sidelines. Right? One thing that's very clear from the things that we have seen recently, including here in DC, is that this is an apolitical issue, that people feel aligned, they feel isolated, and it's driving extremism. And that the simple way to engage them is to engage them with your fellow Americans, to go out there, go to your high school. Everyone went to a middle school, elementary school, high school. The magic of Zoom is that I don't care where you grew up, if you reach out to your high school and say, like, I'm doing this interesting work now as a mental health therapist, or I did this NEAT MA program. I met people in Texas doing that. Schools are extremely desirous for content, and you don't realize that the middle school, elementary school, high school, or college version of you would love to hear from you because they would think this person is incredible. And so don't just thank veterans for their service. The way that you can truly thank them is by actually getting off the sidelines and doing something. So these programs are ways to do that. Now, to your question, of transition, I agree with you, I think it's super important, right? You cannot just simply try to heal a person's mind. And then say, okay, well, you know, what I frequently see in our court, and we do not have a veterans court, we don't have a huge veterans population, but I know several magistrate judges who oversee veterans courts, including in St. Louis, and we've talked about them. Again, there's resources for veterans, but often they don't know how to get them. Part of the problem is that when they were in service, a lot of things were set out, stacked up for them. But when they're then discharged, it's just like figure it out for yourself. And it's like, well, that's not really reasonable or fair to them. And so one of the things they try to do is, again, sort of smooth that transition by assisting them in finding the resources that can help them. But one of the things I've experienced, not in our veterans court, but in our just pre-trial and our post-trial is, so housing, you've already heard a little bit about, but it's employment as well. And we tell every guy, it's predominantly men, we can help you get an HVAC or a CDL, so heating, air conditioning work or a commercial driver's license. And if that's work someone wants to do, that's phenomenal. The they should absolutely do that. However, if that is a ceiling we put on everybody for their transition, then that's not going to work for a lot of people. I'm a total jerk when I drive, which is why I biked here in the morning, because I know I get very angry when I'm driving, and my wife always reminds me, like, what are you doing? Calm down. And I cannot. I'm physically incapable of not being, or at least so I'm told, that you're when I'm driving. And so, right, I would not be a good CDL driver, and I have no skills when it comes to HVAC work, of any sort of building or construction work. And so what would happen to me if I didn't have the privilege and benefits I have, which is to get to have this great job that I have today? I think that I would get very frustrated and want to give up quickly on it. So, I think part of the transition is trying to find 21st century jobs, right? Like you have people, particularly veterans, who have been able to show they have incredible discipline, a real ability to follow direction. These are traits that most managers would want. And so we just had, I know Esther and I talked a little bit about, we got MIT to come teach a coding class, right? 21st century skills down at the DC jail. And it was this huge success. And part of what was interesting is that the guys who were going through the program, so these all incarcerated people, was talking about the challenge of the group, the challenge of the class, sorry, but the benefit of the group, right? Being in a cohort, right? A gang, really, that was there. And there were two guys, we had two different sections in two different parts of the jail, who said, I would have dropped out, but the other guys came literally to me and said no. And they dragged me back in my cell, so we're going to this class, and they helped them, like, off hour studying. And they said, now look at they showed us computer screen, was like, look at the matrix. I was like, I have no idea what any of these means. But then they hit enter or execute, and it was this fabulous website that they had put together. And so I think those 21st century skills are not only important because there's the satisfaction of like doing something that is marketable. It's also skills that can be more interesting. It can lead to, like, look, I mean, at bottom, pay doesn't matter, right? People who are getting put into jobs that yield better results. I have a guy who's doing great for Marine Entry Court, but he's living hand to mouth each month, and he's just like, Judge, I need to find a better job. I've got to my ceiling because he doesn't have a college degree. And he's like, I can't get any higher. I keep applying for his jobs. I cannot get any higher than, and he's not like, he's like, I'm not starving. He's getting like, he's around like $17 or $18 an hour is where he's at now. But there's just no room for growth, right? Like, can you get to 20 or 22? And when you get that ceiling put on you, that leads to hopelessness, right? Transition, the successful transition, your mental health, your housing, its employment, it's to target hopelessness. And if you can do that, I think that is the best way to get to it. And it's then where do we fit in, right? The public defenders, these are the people that I call constantly, right? This is not legal issues. It's like, oh my gosh, so-and-so has this issue. Can you help them? And the answer is always yes, which I appreciate, but I am sorry that I have to ask them to do all this work that social workers are doing. So it's finding other collaborators to support their resources.
And those are all really great points. One of the interesting things that I think when you say that, it's the other thing is people need to be part of their own solutions. So I want to say one thing. One, we push education. So everybody in our court has to, at least you have to graduate high school by the time you finish court, right? And so when we push education more, we've got great programs, back there, SF State. There are lots of programs to give people extra skills. And I just wanted to emphasize what you said, which is building this sense of community. We're very non-hierarchical. We are a team, which isn't to say that it's not important to have all the different institutional participants, including judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, therapists. But we are a collaboration and no one's voice is bigger than anyone else's voice. And then when I said that thing at the beginning, is not us and them, it's just us. You know, the magic, as you said with your coding class, is the community that participants create with each other. And that goes to your point with for transition, because it's about community. And then the other thing that I think we have to remember too in the criminal justice system is agency is important. These are grown-ups in our court. That's in my 7-year-old phrase, grown-ups, you know, I'm gonna be grown-ups someday. But this idea that you are the architect of your future. So I'm always mindful of that at all points of intervention in the system, even with bail decisions and conditions of release and where people live. You know, of course, they're on supervision, so sometimes it's not all their choices, but at the same time, getting buy-in is super important. And I will give you one example of that to your point about the collaboration. We had one guy there's a judge in my district who's amazing, a big brain, always scared me as a lawyer appearing before him, always have to be on your A game. Nobody, but he's tough because he cares so much about getting to the right outcome. And then, so once you know that, it's easier to practice in front of him. But he could throw the book at people if he felt that they weren't doing what they were supposed to do, leaving aside whether that's appropriate, because there might be better interventions. There was one guy who did something incredibly stupid, and it could have been so much worse for him with this judge. The probation went to bat for him, the prosecutor went to bat for him, the defense lawyer went to bat for him, and it wasn't that bad. And this guy came to reentry court and he was complaining. And the other folks in the program just piled on to him and told him he was crazy. And so that wasn't my voice or any of the other institutional stakeholders. That was the community doing an intervention, and I've never seen anything like it. It was awesome. And so I think those are the sorts of things we try to do, you know, to your transition point, because you're taking people who have had experiences that have left them broken. And it doesn't always manifest itself in positive behavior either, right? It spans the range of criminal behavior, including stuff that is concerning. But it's interesting. There actually are interventions that work.
How many more questions do we have? I also want to attention. More.
Great.
How many? But I think we're probably 20 more minutes. 20 more minutes. Okay, great. Thanks. Go ahead. Yeah.
So again, thank you to all three of you for the work that you do. As a decades-long primary prevention practitioner, mostly in schools and communities doing substance abuse and violence prevention, it has been very interesting to me to see a lot of recent articles and documentaries about the use of psychedelic drugs in treating trauma, especially military war trauma experiences. And it reminds me, because I'm also someone who came of age in the 60s, about the experiments that Tim Leary and Richard Albert did at Concord Prison in Massachusetts before they were thrown out of Harvard. And it was amazing the results that they got in doing guided psychedelic experiences with inmates at Concord Prison. And I think they cut the recidivism rate of those inmates that they worked with by 90% at that time. I remember reading in Leary's book that when he was so shocked that the program was automatically just cut off at one point, the prison psychologist he was working with said to him, "These people have a business to run here, and you're cutting into their business." So I want to ask two questions. Do you know about the use of psychedelics at all in prison reentry programs or in the trauma that so many criminals experience? And two, what about the prison industrial complex and the school to prison pipeline that obviously has a racist element to it?
You want to go first?
I guess in in DC, I think there was some local legislation about the use of psychedelics, and so all I know is from the advertising I saw posted up in my neighborhood. I don't know much about it, but I read a recent article in the New York Times about it, and it was super interesting. I think I'll just step back into a broader point is that we are the year 2022, right? We are still fighting many of the problems that we were fighting in the 2000s, the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, and the list goes on, right? So at some point, right, I think all that you're hearing from all three of us is that we need to try, and it doesn't have to be a global, right, thing, like not federal legislation for the entire country, but that's what's fun about being a judge. We get to try in our court on one-offs, on individual people in a collaborative environment. It's not just us through judicial fiat, but it's people coming up with ideas, right? Judge Sorokin trying the first ever restorative justice program. It's us.
In custody.
Yeah, in custody, yeah. And so we can try different things, right? That's where we need people. I think to your point, yeah, it is daunting sometimes because there are, fill in the blank in industrial complex. My mother is a cancer survivor and she was at this great hospital. It was purely a cancer hospital. And she literally while being treated told them, she's like, well, if you cure cancer, you guys would all lose your job. I was like, oh my God. Can we please first have them cure your cancer before you start criticizing them and saying they're sitting on the cure? But I mean, I understood where she was coming from. And so,
You really are funny.
yeah, okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
We would potentially, all three of us would be out of job if we saw crime. And so,
To be out of the job.
but I think yes, that is right. And I think that you just need to find, you're right, there will be people who may be so entrenched, right? I don't think it's maybe willful, but it might be they might be blind and just think like this is the way we do it. It's the best we can do, and that just continues on in that industrial complex. But there are people who want to try different things.
And most people just want to go home at the end of the day, right? So just a couple of things. One, there's a really interesting article some years ago, probably more than 10 years ago, in the New York Times Magazine about ecstasy and the therapeutic aspects of ecstasy. I'm aware of the studies. Of course, all the tech bros are into microdosing these days for sharpness. I will say what's interesting about the therapeutic intervention in whatever form it takes is this thing that it does, including through the restorative justice program of empathy. And by empathy, it is about seeing the context of what you've done. There's some interesting studies in the child pornography setting, because most people in the child exploitation setting, a lot of folks were abused themselves as children. And a friend of mine who's a therapist, that was a dinner party I went to some years ago, she said, it's a lot of them are very resistant to therapy. They talk the talk and they absolutely do not walk the walk. It's let's call it a defense mechanism for purposes of discussion. When they do have the therapeutic breakthrough, which happens rarely, they almost always try to kill themselves immediately. And so it's just, I always thought it was a super interesting illustration. We all, and then the other thing to the prison industrial complex, as you said, there are lots of industrial complexes. Come see San Francisco and the homeless issues that we're trying to confront with ridiculous amounts of money pretty unsuccessfully. It's tough. I think a lot of times people they just go home at the end of the day, right? They don't take their work with them. And this idea of creating a context where your work actually is meaningful and has benefits even in custody, I think it's something that people would gain comfort from, even if they're working there. And I think the trick is to figure out how do you change. I'm quite interested in organizational behavior. I worked on the Enron case, but I've got, talk about interesting insights into organizational behavior. It's interesting. How do you change the institutions? Bureau of Prisons, for example, has almost no program. I think that's terrible. That'll be after I finish this project, maybe someday that'll be a project, but it's you point to a lot of, there's a lot in what you said, and I think what it boils down to is, looking at the problem. There's a guy named Pete Lungo who used to work for the state of Pennsylvania, kind of a political guy, but as a therapist, super interesting. And he says, he talks about what the social scientists do. They don't just do the same old tired thing. He calls it Plan, Do, Study, Act. He works with the FJC, by the way, great people at the FJC on these issues.
The Federal
Federal Judicial Center, Mark Sherman, Cassandra Snyder, Christina Ruffino. Pete works with them, but he says that Pete does Plan, Do, Study, Act. You don't do the same old thing. You identify the problem that you want to address. you identify the outcome you want to achieve. You design a program to try to achieve that outcome. So that's the plan, you do it, you study it, does it work or not? If it doesn't work, then you do something different. So I think that there are a lot of tools that potentially can be brought. It'll be interesting to see if we, we're in the, we're a prosecutor at DOJ. We have top secret security clearances. We, had a certain obligation that attended that. But it will be interesting to see if policies surrounding therapeutic interventions that involve prohibited substances, if you're a prosecutor, if that'll change in the next few years, because there certainly are some interesting studies in that.
I think the next panel actually has some of them, has a BOP. I think Miranda's here for BOP.
Maybe
No, sorry. So for some about the institutional aspects of this issue, I think there were a couple more questions. Grab them before we end. Go ahead.
Hello. Hi, I'm Linda at the Simon Wiesen Consulting for Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles. And we have a partnership with the Los Angeles Superior Court for about 15 years now. They run a beautiful youth court program where they work with 45 high schools across the city, where students are referred if they've committed a hate crime or hate incident, diverted from the system into a youth court. It's a real court supervised by a judge. But the students decide guilt or innocence and have an alternative sentencing form and all kinds of programs they know about in Southern California they can send students to. And our privilege is to do a summer institute to train the youth jurors to be compassionate, empathic, and effective jurors. And over the years, we've iterated the curriculum, which is beautiful for the jurors to have this free funded summer camp in a way with us. Some of them have gone on to law school and made connections with the judges and the lawyers part of the program. Beautifully, some of the defendants have then graduated to become jurors themselves. So amazing program. But one of the things we grappled with over the years too was seeing how we incorporate restorative justice values, principles, practices. The LA Superior Court always reminds us this is not officially a restorative justice program, right? We don't fit some of the technical aspects of it, but so much of the notions of healing and putting all the dignity of our offenders first, and seeing how can we transform and educate our client as well as the community that was kind of create healing outcomes for everybody involved. So I'm wondering for you all, how you would influence, what are your thoughts on restorative justice in your work? How does that come into play?
So, that's a great question. You might talk about this. Our next step is going to try to implement restorative justice components to both our out of custody and in custody. Right. One of the things we're working on now is we have a horrible lack of programming in our pretrial custody. The folks who are detained and they're in Alameda County, and we have a new sheriff coming in. We are very optimistic. There's staffing issues though. That's another really big thing. You guys know this, and because it's a nationwide issue, but there's a real shortage of mental health professionals. For example, I'm aware of your program. It's an amazing program. So one of the things we're going to do with the restorative justice component of our program is we're going to partner hopefully with USF, with a local, Laura Bazelon's there, and she's really interested in this. And so we try to collaborate with other people who've done it. And basically what Zia said, copy, right? We copy, we're going to copy Judge Sorokin. It's kind of, I'm kind of joking, kind of not, but we'll enlist partners. Georgetown has some amazing stuff they're doing. Mark Howard, I don't know if you know Mark, unbelievable, right? So there's smart people doing real things in this world, and the trick is to find them and copy them.
Yeah, so we're DC U.S. Attorney's Office, so Department of Justice is not the court, it's not the public defenders. They themselves, as well as the Office of Attorney General here in DC, there's a woman, Seema Gadwani, she's extraordinary. She really is leading a lot of the restorative justice efforts. She's started with juveniles, but the DC Attorney's Office is, I believe they're really considering and trying to roll out adopting it even to felonies. They're considering it in sex offense, domestic violence cases, and so I think there is and there's a ton of grants, because I was looking again, how can we get some of this funding, for restorative justice, I think restorative Arlington is one here that got just recently grants, some other ones as well, so what we're gonna try to do, we looked at it from the court's perspective, is finding, surrogates. So that's one of the problems, is that you can't always necessarily find a victim for a group to come there, and so if we can find surrogates who have stories to tell for the circle-based sessions, it's a little more efficient, right? Because then you're not trying to, and some people are just better than others at, being that voice to come in there and humanize.
That's what
victims.
Judge Soroka's program does. Now, we'll say this,
Yeah,
David.
because we copied it.
Yeah, but it's interesting, that's an interesting point too, because one of I think of Judge Manley, who's a judge in our district, Superior Court judge. State court judge, and the amazing work he's doing. The states have always had access to lots of grants, they do it really well. And it's sort of ironic where the feds we're suffering from money and we have to scramble around to figure out how do we implement these programmatic components, geared towards a better outcome. But I think that's we don't do it as well as the state. We don't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reaction. So what we do, this is a kind of a joke and kind of not. Whenever one of the clients, we call them clients in the court, that's probation photographer, when they caught a state case, especially a low level one, I was always overjoyed because they would get all of these resources that we're not able to. It's terrible to say, like, yay, you have a misdemeanor, you're on supervision in state court. It's a terrible thing, but it's amazing how how well state courts do it, and how we have to come up with different models to try to do something. But my understanding is with the surrogates and that approach, it's pretty transformative.
Yeah, I mean, another question, but I'll just say that in Boston, they have now, I think they're starting to use actually Second Chance Act funds.
I was
for
gonna
this
say, second.
So they've been able to use it for their circle-based program, because they have one probation officer, Maria Diego, she's extraordinary, but she's doing like 3 jobs, like for the price of 1, so they want to build up infrastructure. And so the Second Chance Act funds, I believe, the administrative office and they've said that actually they can use these to pay the facilitator as well as the surrogates.
Yeah, and on that note, Second Chance Reauthorization Act funds should be applicable to this context. Have you all been able to access those funds? And how well have you been able to engage with, for example, DOJ, who's also, been given some of those funding opportunities? Do you consider, in my experience, I find it kind of a quite a large communication gap between the judiciary and the executive.
Yeah.
On this issue. What's been your
So yes.
Well, it's good. I didn't know, so I'm gonna go talk to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We do use Second Chance Act funds. For example, we do them for all sorts of things. Someone has a lot of tattoos and they want to get rid of their tattoos, and we use Second Chance Act
Right.
funds. We've done housing for people, interim housing for people. So it's interesting. I didn't know that you could for some of these, and we have a very large non-appropriated fund for a lot of it's pro hoc admissions. We're very people like to litigate cases in the Northern District of California. In September 2020, you should have seen the crescendo of litigation that attached the waning months of the Trump administration and all the attacks on the administrative regulatory process. Or big antitrust town or tech, so we have a lot of people from other places that come in and pay the $400 some fee that you have to pay to get admitted to the Northern District when you're not a Cal Bar member. And so we've been able to use a lot of those funds too to support our programming.
Right, yeah.
And talking with the DOJ, here's what I would say. People are very resistant about things that they don't know or understand. And it's so much easier to go to court and not look at the person you're prosecuting. I know that. I used to be a supervisor in my old office, and I would say to people, I actually had the kids on my team when I was supervising the young lawyers. I had them visit prisons, jails, so they knew, right? To give a little context. But it's and I think the current administration, DOJ and Merrick Garland, they're very open to these sorts of things, but embedding it into the culture of the office. There are programs that the office funds in my district, and they could be very youth-oriented programs, and they're big community programs. They don't tend to affect the people who are on supervision. But Philadelphia does it differently. They actually have someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office who's very involved in programs. And if you can, I'm trying to, I kind of would like feel their dreams, build it and they will come. I think about trying to expose as many people as possible to the context of engaging. And then they change their minds about their work. And that goes to the earlier point about, bureaucracies and institutions and our same tired ways of problem solving.
Great point.
Morning, my name is Mira Khan. I'm from an organization called Movement, and we do primary prevention of early extremism, hate crimes across the world. My question is related to the application of your approaches towards extremism and terrorism cases. And one, is it happening? And the second part of my question is, nationwide, do you see a different appetite for applying these approaches for domestic terrorism versus for foreign terrorism cases?
I don't know if you have any kind of perspective since, so much of what happens in the district involves some of those issues.
Sure, so the international terrorism cases, we have a few of them. We had the attack on the embassy when I was a prosecutor, the Benghazi case that was prosecuted under the terrorism authorities. A lot of them do go to the Eastern District of Virginia just because that's where the airport is, Dulles. And so one person's first gets the get venue, and then of course go out of New York. But they do come certainly into here. I did talk to one of the Eastern District of Virginia judges who was a former public defender, about a client. Yeah, he was one of the 9/11 sort of derivative prosecutions. So it's interesting. I think question. I don't have a great data set to say on the foreign terrorism. What is the appetite? Certainly, I think when I don't think I guess in terms of terrorism, but when there's a loss of life, do you think that changes people's sort of views on dangerousness, both current and future? But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be off ramp, right? Doesn't that mean that the ramp is all that more important if the potentials for a violent car accident ahead as opposed to a fender bender? Well, you're going to try to get the person off who's going to, where there could be a greater loss of life. On the domestic side, I think, certainly my experience in this court has been, we are trying through pretrial release always to find ways for people to return to home, to not be incarcerated. I don't think it's just in any genre of cases. I believe our court is trying to do that in a very apolitical way. And our sort of data set right now is that we have a lot of people who are on pretrial release, and there isn't a parade of horribles. We don't have a lot of people who've gone out and tried to commit a new attack on a legislative branch or things like that to try to stop sort of electoral processes or things. And so
Are you doing special interventions with those folks or just typical pretrial supervision?
I think some of it is, a lot of it is social media related and internet related. So there was, I think, an article in the LA Times about this, on how there's been a proliferation in these extremism cases that have come up about courts' restrictions, right, and considering people's First Amendment rights of their ability to view, consume, post content in social media and things like that. Now, the benefit is here is that people are volunteering. That's one of the things Jake was talking about. That you got to get buy-in, right? When people have conditions of release, it doesn't matter if it's a drug case or a terrorism case. But when the person's alternative, you always say, I say like, oh my God, these conditions are so onerous. There is also an alternative that you don't have to contest this. You can stay incarcerated and appeal it, or you can just be incarcerated. Obviously 10 times out of 10 people like, yeah, I'm gonna just not get on Facebook, that it's better than being incarcerated. And so I think what has been super effective for us is getting the buy-in for people to themselves deplatform from the places that were leading them to potentially extremism. I've seen on numerous detention hearings where family members have written in and said, this person went down this rabbit hole, 6 months, a year ago, and they are a totally different person, right? So if you need to look at the person's full life, you cannot just look at today, on this day in front of me, they did this action of extremism. Who were they their whole life? And if they were somebody different their whole life, well, why would we think we can't get them back to where they were for, 20 out of 21 years or something like that? And if we get them to buy in on, well, here's that path to potentially getting off of that off-ramp, right? We cannot push people on the off-ramp. We can present it, we can try to facilitate it, we can make it attractive, but you cannot force it. And my experience has been so far pretty good. That they have, what's in someone's heart, ultimately at the end of the day, sure. it may still have some seeds of extremism or seeds of anger or frustration, but we're not here to prevent people from we're not a thought police, right? We are a public safety instrument. And part of that is trying to encourage them at least to be tolerant of different voices. And if there's ways that we can try to reduce their exposure to it, I think that's been successful.
We have one last question.
Super interesting.
Thank you. I was just wondering, not all of us are legal experts, so if you could talk to us about the roles of magistrate judges versus what I would call a regular judge.
Right, yeah.
And then do you have ultimate authority to make this decision, or do prosecutors get to convince you, or do prosecutors have to agree for these sorts of alternatives? Thank you.
I'll have to speak to our court a little bit. We're, we're creatures of statute. We're Article 1 judges, creatures of statute, as magistrate judges. We do not obviously have the same authority that a district judge does. So how does it work in my district? For a court, we're pretty non-hierarchical. And one of the things that I've really tried to do is grow the program for all judges. I think in a lot of districts, you see mostly the magistrate judges could do the bail decisions, handling a lot of the alternative courts. There are Article 3 judges who are interested. A lot of people we've named before, Judge Montalvo in El Paso, Judge Sorokin, these are Judge Salas, these are Article 3 judges. I think it's really important to get everybody involved as much as you can, because that's what changes practice, including sentencing practice. And how do you do that? I think it's a very district specific thing. So everybody has their own culture. In my district, we kind of sat down, hammered out a memo of understanding with all the participants, including the U.S. Attorney's Office. I feel like it's better if you get buy-in from everybody. It took years to get buy-in from, and it's not a Republican Democrat thing. Oddly, some of the Republicans were more amenable than some of the Democrats. So it's not that, but I think it is really important to get buy-in from the institutional participants, because the more broadly you include people, the more broadly it affects their practice, not just in the courts themselves or programs themselves. I don't know what your view is. Different is. Yeah. Okay.
You got 30 seconds?
Yeah.
Okay, so the difference between a magistrate judge or federal judges and district judges, we really at bottom, we don't oversee felony trials or felony sentencing. But other than that, we're pretty coextensive in our authorities. A lot depends on the consent of the parties. We're obviously cooler, smarter judges. And so often people.
Favorite space, not political.
But within the courthouse, it is very much district by district where we can plug in. But what's neat about our dockets is that the district judge right in the United States versus John Smith, that judge just being John Smith. We read the first faces from the season because we make the bail decision. And then we are sharing magistrate judges cases. So sometimes we have a broader perspective on seeing things. So for instance, there's an acute lack of bed space right now for mental health evaluations. And several district judges didn't realize that because they have kind of segmented cases, but we see all of their cases. And so it's very collaborative in our court as well. I think to your other point, just, how much of this to the prosecutors, they can always appeal to the district judges, the circuit judges, the Supreme Court, but they also are resource strapped. I think it works better when you get buy-in. You also, as Judge Lewis said, get buy-in from public defenders. Sometimes they're defenders, they don't want to do that. But what's great about sitting up in that chair is that, how we custom as judges, is that we can certainly encourage a lot of people to listen to us and think about these things. And so you should just reach out to your judges. We are public servants. I am, and like Judge Wheeler, I'm sure many will tell you, many judges, we get calls from community members, lawyers who just like, I'm curious, like, what's something that we can do? I think a lot of judges would be super excited.
Great, thank you so much. I hope this panel is as instructive for you.